And for a lot of Anglicans, particularly people who are coming to it these days from another tradition, they go to their church and they're experiencing this newer form of the service. And quite frankly, I would argue, missing out on all of these other things that were designed to build full Christian life. And that wasn't just about Sunday. It wasn't just about the Eucharist. That was, in fact, preparing you for the Eucharist.
Right.
Martin Thornton, in his great book on English spirituality, writes about this, that the daily office was the crown in which the jewel of the Eucharist was placed. What we ended up doing was, in our sort of consumeristic, materialistic society, we said all you need is the jewel, and that played for a certain extent among people in that regard. But I think when you lose the crown and everything else built around it, then you've actually the jewel is out of its proper place. And it's easy for the jewel to become much more superstitious, and which, of course, was a problem that was happening in the Middle Ages that our service was designed to alleviate.
Welcome to the Curious Curate YouTube channel. I'm so excited to welcome our guests today, Father Richard Tarsitano, who is the vicar at Trinity Connersville. And we're going to ask him some questions about what he's doing in Connersville and kind of his approach to that mission and his ministry, generally speaking. So, Father Tarsitano, welcome to the show.
Well, it's very good to be here.
Yeah. Father Tarsitano and I have kind of been mutuals in different social media and other kind of platforms. And we got to meet in person at Savannah, which was really fun for the Anglican Way Conference. So glad that we get to have this conversation. And so I guess just we'll talk about a little bit about your background that led you to your current ministry setting, and then we'll talk a little bit of the background about your approach to the ministry that you're doing. So I guess just to start off, you're vicar at Trinity Connersville in Indiana, and I guess how did that kind of come about?
Well, that's a good question. For 5 years, I was rector of a parish in Florida, and we were in quite an affluent area. We were in Clay County, which is technically the reddest county in America, and also we had 2 golf courses in our small county, kind of a sort of a suburb of Jacksonville, if you get kind of a sense of it.
Okay.
And that has its own ministry challenges. I always like to say that people that thought they'd already died and gone to heaven, they could have brunch and play tennis and all of that. But we were very blessed at that time. I was rector there for 5 years, and we were blessed to grow in property and in souls. But I had a curate at the time, and we were looking out, my wife and I, we were approaching an age at which we knew that if we were going to start a plant somewhere, now was the time. And we had strong conviction towards an area that had gone through an economic downturn, and then an area that had gone through the opioid crisis. And so we were looking out across the vast swath of America, and we had an idea. We assumed that with so much of the main line and so much of progressive Christianity shrinking, that there would be properties and places that could be taken over by missionaries, essentially. And that these places had been abandoned. And so that was another factor of us looking at Connersville, Indiana, which had an Episcopal church there since the 1850s, had built a lovely chapel and then a large church in town, and over time had essentially abandoned the faith of the people who built the place. And sure enough, by the time it was closed in 2016, there was only a handful of folks there. And so they, sold the building, and it was going to be developed into condominiums when COVID happened. So a friend of mine said, all your criteria seems to be met by Connersville. Connersville is sort of a classic case of where they had a gigantic amount of manufacturing, which brought in, interestingly, a large number of Appalachians to work in the factories. And then all the factories left, including the Ford plant, which closed in 2007. Add to that the opioid epidemic in America, and you have a recipe for some hard times. And so we came to the area, my wife, actually also my brother and my mother, who we grew up as Anglicans and grew up in church plants. So it was kind of and it's hard to see, jokingly, the family business. We all came up, and I, at the time, the jurisdiction I was in didn't really have funds for missions, so it's kind of a stepping out in faith, as they say. We sold our home and our car and a few other things, and just bought the property ourselves, and started working the area for Christ. My uncle jokingly said it was a tremendously sort of like that plot for the movie We Bought a Zoo, but yeah, in this case, we bought a church. He made a graphic and sent it to us as sort of a joke. And so, we have a strong heart for places that have been abandoned by so many churches and by so many jurisdictions. You look at Connersville in its history, and there's 12,000 souls here, but it isn't trendy. It isn't one of these places where people are necessarily thinking that the hot new church is going to show up. But I think it's very important for us not to leave people abandoned, particularly where the Anglican way once was thriving, and once had a strong home. I mean, it's so bad, though, that when the church was started, nobody knew what an Anglican was. Nobody has. I mean, that's in our entire church is filled with people who were not Anglicans or Episcopalians. And so that has been a unique opportunity in starting a plant, has been to do our best to build a culture around, in many ways, the culture that built a strong Anglican faith in this city generations ago.
Yeah. And what, you guys came right around COVID or right after COVID?
We did. We came right during COVID,
Okay.
which was also a fun time.
Yeah.
And made some people scratch their heads. But one of the things, as we kind of look back on COVID, I know a lot of people don't particularly like to do that. But as we look back on COVID, there was a strong moment where people had to evaluate what they believed and why they did.
Yeah.
And so starting a church during COVID may seem somewhat counterintuitive, but if one reads, like, for example, the historian Rodney Stark, who wrote about the rise of Christianity, he has a wonderful section of his book where he talks about how Christianity grew in times of plague.
Yeah.
Because the pagan priests would all leave town. They didn't know about germ theory, but they knew if you stayed in a town when there was a plague, you died.
Yeah.
Whereas the Christians stayed and cared for folks.
Yeah.
And coming out of that, they always grew. So there was a certain extent in which we also benefited from that sort of classic. If you believe in the life to come, if you believe in the resurrection of the dead, then something like a plague doesn't paralyze you.
Yeah. Well, that's really helpful to kind of get the context of the environment that you're in, its kind of history, and intentionally entering into a place that not only I think is forgotten by the church or the mainline church, but I think by a lot of America overall. And so to enter, that's helpful to understand the context of intentionally seeking a place like that out. And so I'm curious, as you went, not only did you intentionally choose kind of Midwestern, town with rich history of manufacturing and all the kind of things that go on with that, but you also chose, I think, very intentionally an approach to how you established your mission over there. And I'm curious about what was the thought process behind the decision of having a classical Anglican approach. So I guess maybe first, if you don't mind defining what you think is classical Anglicanism, and then if you don't mind afterwards kind of giving us a little insight into your approach. Has that always been kind of your how you identified within the Anglican tradition? And if not, what led to that change? So what is classical Anglicanism? When did you embrace classical Anglicanism? And what was the thought process behind starting a mission with that kind of idea in mind? So,
yes. So a lot of the monikers that surround the Anglican way are quite confusing and strange even. There's sort of a sense in which you meet an Anglican and you start to have to sort of a conversation. What do you mean by that? What does that look like to you? And that's a fairly new phenomenon. It was not that long ago that a person who was an Anglican a general understanding of what that meant was a fidelity to the formularies of the church, particularly the Book of Common Prayer, as the covenant between the church and its lay people, and then the whole body of Christ within that organization. So I have the very perhaps odd pedigree of being a lifelong Anglican, which is one of those funny things. I think a big strength of the Anglican way in the 21st century is that there are lots of people who are coming into it, who are
Yeah.
coming from other traditions or from being dechurched or unchurched. But a symptom of that is you oftentimes do not have a lot of institutional memory about
Yes.
being an Anglican. And so I've been an Anglican my entire life. I was baptized an Episcopalian. My father was an Episcopal priest who was defrocked because he and his large parish in Denver, Colorado, wanted to use the traditional prayer book in America. And from there, we kind of went all over the country, either starting churches or revitalizing churches, and finally ended up settling in Savannah, where I spent most of my formative years. And growing up as an Anglican in that period, basically the 80s, the 90s, was obviously a time of gigantic flux. But my father is fairly well known in conservative Anglican circles for his book, for example, An Outline of an Anglican Life, which is used by many people for their catechisms. But he wrote many things in articles and books on the preservation of the Anglican way. And he would never have described himself, and this was a phrase I didn't hear until I was much older, the idea of being a classical Anglican or being a Reformed Anglican. Those were kind of new ideas that oftentimes I find are used by people, not always as a pejorative way, but used as a way of describing someone who is interested in continuing the Anglican heritage as handed down over the last 500 years. So that is a kind of a fascinating feature of this. I would not, when we were planning the mission in Connersville, we did not have in our mind some kind of partisan plan of creating something as a flag on the hill for something called classical Anglicanism. Our goal was very missionally to look at what has empirical evidence of working across multiple cultures, multiple centuries, multiple different types of people, that has some evidence of actually discipling people in the love and service of Jesus Christ. So for us, the choice to use the Book of Common Prayer and to do what it says was a missional choice. This
Yeah,
was not
that's so
some kind
interesting.
of partisan choice. I think the apotheosis of prayer book worship is the 1662, and kind of all prayer book traditions, all national prayer books are in conversation with that. And in a Anglican way in America that is very much trying to find itself again after the explosion of apostasy within the Episcopal Church, having that unity around sort of a stable foundation is going to be quite important, and we saw that for ourselves. Being a classical Anglican is what they used to call just being a churchman,
Yeah.
right? It's just someone who follows the rule of faith as found in the Book of Common Prayer. And coming out of the Reformation, that was exactly what was happening in England, and that's what was supposed to be happening in all the national churches.
Yeah.
So again, it's sort of a definition of classical Anglicanism, I think, is someone who takes seriously and binds themselves for the sake of the church and for the sake of his people, to following that what's found in the tradition that's been handed down to him through the formularies, the Book of Common Prayer, the Articles of Religion, the homilies, the ordinal, those very bedrock things that define what it means has meant to be an Anglican over hundreds of years. And in an age of chaos and confusion, that's a very helpful thing, and quite frankly, almost like a life raft
Yeah.
in this mad world in which we tend to find ourselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that you said there was this. It wasn't like you had a partisan angle or anything like that. You wanted to you trusted it. It's worked through the ages. It's worked through different cultures. When I think of church planting, and perhaps some of the listeners might think the same as well, kind of the initial kind of ideas that might come to mind is innovation and experimentation and creativity and contextualization.
Yes.
And, did you ever have a fear when you were starting out that plant that, though you committed to using the 62 and following kind of the way that Anglicanism worked before the liturgical movement and whatnot, did you ever fear that might not work? That might backfire?
I mean, and there's a certain does fear enter into this? I feel like now I'm on the Joe Rogan podcast. Fear was never a factor. No, but yes, of course, when one is selling one's earthly possessions and moving one's family to a strange place, there's always a concern that what if this doesn't work? But again, what drove us towards embracing a classical Anglican model, for lack of a better word, was the determination that America was changing. It is changing.
Yeah.
And the kind of model that you're talking about, which is in all the books and in all the seminaries, those kinds of things,
Right.
that model that's everywhere was built for a world that didn't exist prior to the Second World War, and it most certainly won't exist in the future.
Right.
And so it was built for this niche time, this very, in quite many ways, strange time in American history, of where prior of gigantic church participation, or the desire for people to participate in churches in order to sort of mark themselves as good people. Whereas as we move out of that era, in some ways, it's kind of madness to think that that's going to be an effective way to discipline 21st century Christians,
or
22nd century Christians.
And that's helpful to think. I'm in Wheaton, so Willow Creek is down the road. Kind of like the mecca of that movement. But that whole mega church / church planting model assumes a Christian people that are dissatisfied with whatever their church background was, and we're in a place where that's not really the case anymore. You can't assume that there's that dissatisfied group anymore. And that's really helpful, actually, that you pointed that out. And so how do you explain, I guess, the heart of this approach? What is this, I guess, transitioning to what does that look like on the ground? So you started this church, you're using the 62. Perhaps what does that actually concretely look like in terms of what a service might look like, what the weekly and daily rhythms might look like? And so maybe start out with, okay, classical Anglicanism is this, but what does that actually look like on a mission?
So you mentioned sort of dissatisfaction with churches in the mid-century, and a lot of that is because those churches abandoned the very things that created community within them.
Yeah,
because community was so easy to have, because everyone was just showing up, and you had all these children too that you then sent someplace else to not be part of your service, which also happened during the baby boom. Children's church was invented at that point. So much of what the church had done throughout its history to disciple people was thrown away. And then it was a gigantic surprise that people no longer were discipled and went to churches that were terrible at it, such as Willow Creek, which is terrible at discipling Christians. It's good at filling seats. It's bad at making people who will take up their cross and die, which is the whole purpose of this. So when thinking about our own mission, we very much wanted to recapture not only what was lost in a place like Willow Creek, but what was lost in the mid-century church, and in that era. So when you think about what does every day look like for our mission, so if people may not know this, a big part of the 20th century shakeup of the Anglican way in America and in England, for that matter, was a movement to have the Holy Communion more often. Right, to have the Lord's Supper more often. You got to have it every week, or it's not even really a legitimate service. What was lost in that, and again, I'm an enormous fan of the Lord's Supper as often as possible. What was lost in that was the daily office.
Yep.
So what used to be the idea of having an Anglican Sunday without morning prayer would have been fantastical for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And going through that with people in the public service of your church was teaching them and catechizing them how to do that service. And it was so bad when I was at my first church, people just didn't know how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? They just didn't have any idea how to do
Yeah.
morning or evening prayer.
Right.
And you would go to you would go to synods at places, and they would, have someone publicly do it. And not only did the minister not really know what they were doing, but the people had no idea because it just wasn't part of their life of being Anglicans. And that was a weird thing.
Right.
That's incredibly strange.
And like, let's just, for the listeners,
Yes.
maybe we're assuming we might know what an average Sunday looked like for
Yes.
400 years, but maybe paint the picture. The Church of England
Sure.
is Reformed, and if you're not a cathedral parish, and even a cathedral, but if you're the average Anglican until discovery of Hippolytus's whatever.
Yes.
What did a Sunday normally look like? What are you talking about?
Right.
Yeah.
You can even read books about Protestant Episcopalians in the 1890s, 1910s, 1920s. Your average Sunday was a day of prayer. So you had morning prayer, litany, ante-communion, which is the beginning of the communion service, which includes the readings and a sermon. And depending on the parish, you would have communion after that once a month, twice a month, sometimes less than that. And then you would have in the evening prayer, and the curate would catechize the children at that service.
Yeah.
And that was and even between that, you would have lunches and eating together, and sometimes studies within all of that. So it was a full day of worship, but it was built around all the offices one finds in the Book of Common Prayer. In fact, one advantage of using the 1662 International Edition, I think there are actually many advantages. I think it's the first prayer book made in a long time that's designed for people who aren't Anglicans. It has things like a glossary in the back. It has red rubrics. It has explanations for the services. It has the homily of justification. There's lots of reasons why I think it is the most missional prayer book that's been made in generations. But part of it is its simplicity and its desire to have you go through these same rhythms over and over and over again as a way of forming you around a rule of life and a rule of faith.
Yeah.
And so if you're following that again and again and again, it can't help but change you and form you. So that normal, cycle of a Sunday was changed in the 20th century. And for a lot of Anglicans, particularly people who are coming to it these days from another tradition, they go to their church and they're experiencing this this newer form of the service, and quite frankly, I would argue, missing out on all of these other things that were designed to build a full Christian life. That wasn't just about Sunday. It wasn't just about the Eucharist. That was, in fact, preparing you for the Eucharist.
Right.
Martin Thornton, in his great book on English spirituality, writes about this, that the daily office was the crown in which the jewel of the Eucharist was placed. What we ended up doing was in our sort of consumeristic, materialistic society, we said all you need is the jewel,
right?
And that played for a certain extent among people in that regard. But I think when you lose the crown and everything else built around it, then you've actually the jewel is out of its proper place, and it's easy for the jewel to become much more superstitious. And which of course was a problem that was happening in the Middle Ages. That our service was designed.
I mean,
alleviate.
I hear so often, like, I need the Eucharist every week, which is, this is good. I mean, we should want the Eucharist every week. We should want to commune with the body and blood of our Lord. But it's, I think the way that you phrase it is so helpful, is that it's not that some people might say, like, oh, this vision that is being proposed it's like this hyper Protestant thing and it's diminishing the Eucharist. But really what in reality is doing, it's elevating the Eucharist. It's elevating its place. And when we elevate all the structures and rhythms and that the Anglican tradition offers, it elevates everything. And it seems like there's been a massive disconnect, probably since the development of the 79 prayer book or this desire to be as ancient as possible. When the other thing is people were catechized very differently when there was maybe more accessible communion. I mean, the stakes for everybody were way higher, and we don't. My criticism, if I can go on a little bit of a rant, is we're not preparing our people in the same way to receive, and that's what the litany does. That's what the exhortation does.
Yes.
It actually prepares people for Holy Communion, and you're right. It certainly does add a little bit of a superstitious. It can develop superstition in the hearts of people when it's offered every week without all these other structures in place. Now, if people did morning prayer, the litany, anti-communion, communion every week, that would be a different story. And the daily offices are offered, daily in the parish. I mean, that's a different case. But so many are I think, ignorant of what the prayer book is actually trying to do.
Right. And I think that was a function also of priests and a lot of other factors. I mean, when you look at the changes that were made, when you walk through the 1662 and then look at the changes that are made in either the American 28 or the American 79, and some of them were made for brevity, right? Let's just make this thing shorter. And you could see why priests were pushing for that. Like there's a sense in which there's just too much. I want this thing to be smaller and shorter, or my people won't be able to handle it. Those kinds of theories. But a week in our church looks like, we are blessed to be able to offer the daily office in the morning and the evenings, each day, which is also a wonderful opportunity for me to meet with people who come in. We have a sign outside that says we have our services every day. This is something even the Roman Catholic Church down the street can't offer, because it had their one service they can't handle because their priest is pulled in so many directions and has multiple parishes. So we can offer 2 services a day, which is an opportunity for people to come in and pray. We also keep our church open, and then in those services is also an opportunity for me to meet my people, to have them come, and if necessary have spiritual counsel. They know where I am, they know I'm praying, and it's modeled for them that they know this is also what's expected of them. So even if they can't make it to the church to pray, they know at home, this is what we're doing and this is what we're going through.
Wow.
We're all studying the same scriptures. We're all working through these same things together. So that's I think an incredibly important thing. But you can see why churches stop doing this. Because sometimes we'll say, well, what if no one shows up? People will tell me this, like, gosh, I tried this for a week and nobody came and it was awful. And my response to that is always, well, I mean, you were there. You got to pray with Jesus and the angels. That's pretty great. And also, if we're setting up a gigantic change in the way it means to be human, right? So much of human life used to be organized around the church. If you think about what the Anglican way is trying to do, morning prayer before you go to work, then you work in your day, then evening prayer when you're done with your work. Like your whole life is now not revolving around work and leisure, but around your church and your life and being in the body of Christ. It's changed the way you think about your whole day. That took a long time to beat out of people, and it's going to take a long time to bring that back for people. So it may be that you are part of the generation now that faithfully does this and has only a handful of people who join you every day. But maybe it's that next generation. I think this is the case that happens, where everyone is just used to this being the way a church operates and knowing that they can get it, and then actually being attracted to it. I mean, I have people who come to the daily office who say, I don't know how I lived before I did this. Is the phrase they'll use. I don't know I didn't know how to pray. I didn't know how to live until I was able to come in and plug myself into this beautiful service of prayer and thanksgiving that we're allowed to privileged to be able to pray every day. That again is not in competition with the Eucharist, but is preparing us to rightly receive the great gift of God.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask about, the logistical challenges, but I think that you just already answered that question and outlined it so well. I think one thing I would add to it is, I think this is also, unfortunately, a memory issue, which is American Anglicanism, is that the 1604 canons, if I'm not mistaken, required that the daily offices be offered morning and evening every day. And
yes, that was the English requirement. The American requirement didn't have that.
Yeah.
but it was just the common thing. I mean, that was everywhere. I mean, that was a thing that was happening.
Yeah.
I mean, it is not until pretty late in the game that this gets suppressed.
And we should submit to the wisdom of the canons too,
Right,
even if it's not required. And
right,
I think that what you said, the generational vision, the long-term vision, must not be lost, in all of this. And I mean, I would encourage if any rectors are listening to this. Well, what about that one or those two souls that do come?
yes,
Um, that is amazing too. Um, and I think of just the priest's role of interceding on behalf of the body, and
yes.
you should be doing that regardless. So why not do it within the building of the gathering?
I like to
So
tell people that Richard Hooker was doing this while also writing the laws of ecclesiastical polity.
yeah,
If he can handle that, you could probably too.
I think
Uh,
so. He didn't
yeah,
have travel sports for his kid. I'm kidding, but
that's right.
there's all these
Uh,
other kind of idols in our day that I think
yes,
it's even more important to lay this down and to
right.
give that contrast, almost that counter formation opportunity. If I'm using real missional kind of church planting language here, but it is counter formation. It's
Yes,
what is running your morning, what is running your evening, and I think it at least opens the door for the average person to at least wrestle with that. Okay, my church is offering this.
right.
How do I maybe is there a place for me to rearrange my own priorities? And I think that's
And
in
it also
suburban
gives us,
America really important today.
yes, it also gives an opportunity for people who are mourning, people who are joyous, for when things happen. I don't have to schedule another service. Well, if
Yeah,
something big happens in the culture, I'm just there, and people can come and pray and rejoice or be sad. Like that's a
yeah,
space where they know they could come and be in the temple of God. And that's incredly important. The rest
yeah,
of our week looks like we do the litany on Wednesdays and Fridays, which is the 1662 in the rubrics requires, which is another thing that faded away, sadly. And so that's another thing we do for morning prayer. We do our litany on Wednesdays and Fridays, which is also wonderful, and I highly recommend. And then for our Sundays, we're kind of in a didactic period, sort of a training period, where right now we break up the requirements, because the 1662 requires that very service we described of morning prayer, the litany, and at least anti-communion and evening prayer every single week. So what we do now, and we're working towards kind of bit by bit adding more things into it as the years go on. Time is the great enemy, and so our goal is to sort of hit like sort of an hour and a half and a little bit over, if it is what people can generally take at this juncture. But we tend to do services. One week will be morning prayer and the litany, and then the next week will be morning prayer and the Lord's Supper.
yeah,
And so that we can essentially in 2 weeks get the whole cycle.
yeah,
But again, that is an imperfect solution to moving forward. Ideally, what we would have is morning prayer, litany, and the communion every single week. Along with, we also have evening prayer every week. But that would be the goal. But again, that ends up being about almost a 2-hour service.
sure,
And I think eventually that'll be a thing. I think that's
yeah,
you can build within a congregation the
yeah,
desire for that. Um, but you have to start out bit by bit and
yeah,
build that idea of what's important, what are we doing, and have them familiar with all the parts of it.
right,
Right? So
yeah,
many churches only do the litany, once a year, twice a year, or that kind of thing. Well, then
yep,
they're never going to understand what it's for, which is really meant to be 3 times a week. I mean, the classic Book of Common Prayer wants that more often than communion,
right.
which is wild to consider. But again, it's necessary because
Because
it's
praying for the
driving.
world is important.
Right.
Yeah.
Praying for the world and everyone you love and everyone you know and your enemies.
Yes.
And because the litany is teaching you how to pray,
Yep. Yep.
and we absolutely need that.
And I was gonna. It's. I think some people when they hear this kind of approach that this whole thing might be too foreign.
Huh?
But even with your answer, you're displaying some contextual sensitivity. Like, okay, a 2-hour service at this juncture would not be ideal or good for my people. But what would you say to people that I hear this all the time? Like the old English is going to be a roadblock. It's going to be an obstacle. The length of the service is going to be an obstacle. Following the rubrics is going to be an obstacle. What would you say to the person that will push back on those lines? Because I think there's this dumbing down of the average, like the average person cannot handle these and thous and cannot handle an extended prayer of oblation or something. And I want you to, from your experience, um, have you seen that to be the case, that it's an obstacle, or what have you seen?
I think there are two parts to this. I think the first part is the incorrect assumption by a lot of people that the main apologetic part of your church is your service, right? So there's a sense in which the services job, the Sunday services job, is to attract people to your church and attract people to, for lack of a better word, the discipline of your church. And so when they're thinking about the main Sunday service, one of the main concerns is will this be a thing that attracts people to stay and come back next week?
Right.
And I think that is an incorrect way of thinking about the Sunday service. And I think it was attractive to people because it allowed them to pretend as if they didn't need to be evangelists or evangelize.
Yeah.
This is particularly true of Episcopalians. The average Episcopalian talked about their faith to a friend once every 21 years. And there was a sort of sense one could get with, oh, well, but the service is so beautiful and attractional. That's what gets people to come. I don't need to talk about my faith with other people. And that's just false and wrong. So the way I talk to my folks all the time, and the way I talk to myself, is to remember that what will bring people into this church, and again, this is just statistically sound, but it's also just across church history, is me loving them enough to be vulnerable to them, such that I can let them hurt me with rejection or whatever.
Right.
That I build a relationship with them, that I want to die for them, right? That's a thing that actually brings a person into the idea of doing the very strange thing in our world of becoming a Christian.
Yeah.
And it's strange everywhere, no matter how much you relativize it or try to make it, baptize every single part of the culture to try to make it feel that person is as unstrange as possible. The whole thing is strange when you get to it, and it should be strange. So I constantly want to build opportunities for the first place in which a person comes in contact with us isn't necessarily the Sunday service, which again, this is true for if you think of the church now as being much more like the church of the first 300 years than like the church of Christendom, this makes a lot more sense. I want the Sunday service to be the means by which, after we've already brought a person in and built a relationship with them, that this is the thing that then disciplines them and changes them into a person fit for the new heaven and new earth, right? I'm trying to make a royal priest out of them, not convince them to stay, right? The convincing them to stay is the work of the Holy Spirit, and also the work of our people who are doing that work at all the fellowship opportunities that we have around, and also inviting them to their homes and everything else. Like all of that is doing that work. It is not the service's job to do that.
Yeah.
And that's a very important factor that I always like to start off with.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. The conversation with folks. Two, I find that the people who have the most problems with these and thous are not people with a high school education. It tends to be overeducated whites. If you get a master's degree, you probably hate these and thous. And some of that is because I was in a school of education for my sins. And I was taught that you shouldn't give children or anybody older texts because they won't understand them, and they won't be able to interpret them. And the reason that this was told to us, because it was ideological, right? Because they didn't want people reading older texts. Because if you're trying to build a progressive utopia, then the last thing you want is people to read old things. And there's a certain sense where even people who are against that ideology have been, basting in it in their academic lives. And it's just sort of the thing that they know and the thing that they think is true.
Right.
But when you actually go out into the field, you find that, what's the most read Bible in the country? The King James. Okay. Who's that most read by? Oh, it's read by it's the number one Bible for African Americans in America. Oh, are they all super educated? What happened there? Oh no, they're not. They just understand it because it's been passed down to them. And the same is true of, anecdotally. When I was teaching, I taught when I was in seminary. I don't recommend this. When I was in seminary, I was also teaching 6th through 8th graders at first a public school and then a parochial school. And my 6th graders always had them read the Jungle Book. And the Jungle Book has a series of, whenever the animals talk to one another, they talk in these and thous and ye's. And it took me, probably half an hour to teach 6th graders what this meant. And then they got it. And then they would even go out in the hallways and talk like that.
Yeah.
So the idea that this is a thing that can't be taught to people is just science fiction.
Yep.
And it's just not true. Additionally, the teaching of this is in passing down is also an important thing.
Yeah.
I say this to people, and football is a very, very popular thing in America. But to understand a football game, you have to understand a tremendous amount of terminology.
Yes.
Things like quarterbacks, halfbacks, tailbacks, wide receivers, ends arounds, jet sweeps, all these things.
Yep.
And people will learn all this because they love the thing, right? And then
Yeah.
fathers will pass that down to their sons and teach them it because they love it.
Right.
They want them to know about it.
Yeah.
And actually, in that passing down, in that interchange, is the thing that makes strong connections that can then last through the future. I mean, this is just Deuteronomy 6, for pity's sake. So when that's abandoned for this very new idea that actually all of our prayers have to sound like 1970s English, because that's the English that's going to last forever, because that was the English of, for example, the baby boom, and that's how things are going to be forever, is fantastical to imagine. And can be, quite frankly, ignored, I think, rather easily.
Yeah.
Everything about this is going to require change in the person. Right. The whole thing of becoming a Christian should be an understanding that vast amounts of who we are is going to have to be changed.
Right.
And so it is not at all. A matter of fact, I think we benefit from being able to say to people, these are the same prayers, the same words that hundreds and hundreds of years of English-speaking Christians have said and have kept on their lips as they went into battle, as they watched their loved ones die, as they died themselves. That is of much, much more value than trying to chase some ephemeral, lowest common denominator English so that my service will be more apologetic to people theoretically.
Yeah, and you think of, I mean, most of Anglicans through history probably had less education who prayed these very words and did not complain about it at all. And I think I want to piggyback on the thing you said earlier, but the first thing, I think it's this phenomenon of just overlooking, whether it's the working class or middle America. It's funny that this is, I hope people who listen to this realize that this phenomenon of overlooking folks and almost patronizing them, it manifests itself not only in politics, but it's manifesting itself on the ground.
Yes.
And I love that point about maybe the white elites, academics. I'm in a college town.
Right.
It's just another way that shows us how out of touch they can be, and how that out of touchness and projecting that on people is actually harmful and dehumanizing in many ways. So I just appreciate you mentioning that, and I hope people really listen to that. And if I think that football example is so apt. We teach people what we love, and there's always a barrier of entry for anything that's worthwhile. And we act like in matters of divinity. For some people, they act like in matters of divinity that ought not to be the case. And on your missional point there, it reminded me of, in the middle of the Oxford movement, the slum priests were engaging, the poor and the overlooked during the post-industrial kind of world that was in London at the time. And I read the Oxford Handbook on that chapter, and the writer interestingly says, oftentimes it's the aesthetic that's accredited to what's going on, but really it was these priests were out in the streets loving people. And when the shepherd smells like the sheep, that's what's going to bring people in. It's not And for some reason, this romanticizing of the liturgy, that it's this all-encompassing thing that does so many things, and you almost get to just sit back and let the liturgy do it all. It's this over-romanticization of divine worship. And it doesn't matter what kind of liturgy or tradition. I mean, you just have to get out there and love people, and people will come. So I just think that's such a helpful reminder. So thank you for sharing those points. I think those are so important for Anglicans today. Where do you think that kind of, I mean, you mentioned, the prior generation, but maybe people who weren't raised, in the baby boom, but still seem to parrot these kind of talking points, the liturgy, the Eucharist. I mean, it's said in a way that it assumes it does so much. Where do you think this comes from, and how can this be corrected since I think that this is a very popular notion in the province? How can this be kind of slowly but surely maybe corrected? What would your advice be on a more maybe macro level beyond your context?
I think I definitely want people to recognize that we have been given a tremendous gift in our liturgy, and that it is a tremendously powerful at what it was designed to do, right? It was designed to make a Christian nation. And it does that as people are brought into contact with it over time. And I think also daily. I think that was also a really important part of it that's left off a lot. But I think a big reason why, so the ACNA, this is still a prevailing idea, is because you do have so many people who are coming out of the Episcopal Church, and that was the way it operated. And there was also a sense in the Episcopal Church, which was not helpful, it was that if you think of your church as the place for the elite, and well, if people don't understand it, then who cares? They shouldn't be here. There's also a sense of that. Or do we really want that person here in our church? Maybe obviously we don't. They're not the right type of person. That was a prevailing thought. And whenever people leave an organization, they always have to look and say, well, what is the baggage we brought with us into this new organization? Right. Yeah. This was a thing that puzzled me incredibly at my first church that I was rector of. There were lots of people who just didn't want any new people there. Partially because they'd been hurt by this was a church that had left the Episcopal Church. They'd been hurt by people in the Episcopal Church, and they just kind of wanted to be in their spot, go to their basically treat the church as kind of a chapel they were going to go to until they died, where they could say kind of the same prayers, and then who cares after that? They're going to be dead anyway. And there's a certain sense which you just have to fight against that with everything we have, and remind ourselves that we are, this might be the early church. God in his mercy may hold back and bring another 1,000, 2,000 years of souls into his kingdom. And we have to be prepared for that, and be the church that's looking forward to that and ready for it. And rather than, we're the church of right now, and only now matters.
Right.
Or only my experience matters. My holiness matters. My feeling of elevation in this sacred space matters. Like those, again, I don't want to at all stamp on the idea that the Anglican way is the best way to be a Christian, and we've been blessed with the best way to pray. I think that's absolutely true. But we also have to recognize that all of this should be driving you to go out into the highways and byways and compelling people to come in to worship the living God.
Yeah. And I wonder, and we've seen the fruit of thinking of the right now. Okay, in 1979, people were thinking about the right now. And I think you pose this great question or this other idea for the minister is a righteous man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. And what is that what is that ecclesial inheritance that we're leaving? Because we are, in a way, in a fresh start with Anglicanism. This is a new season. And I guess one question I have on a liturgical note, maybe some listeners, I'm thinking of maybe even just ideas that I've heard, with the kind of the Renaissance or the beginning of the 1662 international version. What would you say to someone who says, well, why not use the 28, since that's kind of the historic American expression of classical Anglicanism, and the 1662 hasn't really been used on this side since the colonial era.
Yeah.
What would you? Why the 1662 and not continue in the American patrimony?
Great question. It's a little bit inside baseball, but it is a good question.
Yeah.
It's a question I never get here from anybody who ever comes into my church,
Yes.
which is
Sure.
funny, right? So it's like, but again, like people who are in the Anglican way and like, oh man, what's going on there? Like again, my people have, and that's a good thing in many ways. So there are a few reasons. I mentioned before that I think in this realignment, in this really international realignment, that it makes sense for the ACNA, I argue, and really all Anglicans to look to things like the Jerusalem Declaration and the various things coming out of confessing Anglicans around the world. What is the thing that unites us? What is the basis of our liturgical theology? And the space that's been found is the 1662 again. And really, all prayer books come from that. All national prayer books derive from that in some way. They're in conversation with it in many different ways. The American prayer book tradition is a fascinating one and is often misunderstood. The theology of the 1928, particularly like the Eucharistic theology, is not different than that of the 1662. The men who created it at the time, and even the parts of the American prayer book that derive from the Scottish book, sort of. Also, the men who made the Scottish book said that this is the same theology as the 1662. So there's no deviation there between that.
I'll be interviewing Drew Keane on his talk he gave last year at some point. So
100%.
So that will be expanded. That point you're making has been argued by very brilliant people. So
anyway, and he's the guy to ask. He's been on our podcast and wonderful. Yeah, so dig into that with him. But the American prayer book tradition, as Father Gavin Dunbar has stated, the best things about the 1928 are the things it carries over from the 1662. It's important to remember that the 1662 was used in America for quite a long time. When one thinks of, the difference between the 1604 and the 1662 are pretty minimal. So one thinks of sort of Jamestown to the Constitutional Conference. That's a long period of time, actually a lot longer than the 1928 was used in America, which is an interesting thing to consider. But in any event, I think the 1928 it benefits from everything it carries over from the 1662. But it also, there were things in the water in the 20s that were not great. I mean, they tend to the revisions of the prayer book that happened in the 20th century tended to be at weird times. But the 20s were a crazy time for people. The 70s were a crazy time to be doing liturgical revision. And you see some of that aspect within both revisions. When one looks at, for example, what was done to the baptismal service, like compare the baptismal service of the 1662 with the 1928, and oftentimes one will be surprised. For example, certain amounts of regeneration language is cut out, which is often a shock to those who are more inclined to be Anglo-Catholics. Or the marriage service is also, quite frankly, been bowdlerized and butchered. And you see the beginnings of a nascent move towards both, interestingly, I think, feminism and chauvinism. It breaks up the asymmetry relationship in there. For example, it gets rid of the idea that the wife is to obey her husband. It also gets rid of the idea that the husband is to give his wife all of his things. And you can see why men and women would be inclined to think that this is a good thing. I don't want to obey, and I don't want to say that my wife has all of my possessions. But of course, that was a wonderful and beautiful sacrificial model in the 1662, derived from Ephesians 5, that is cut away in the 1928. And there are a lot of other things, like just compare services, and you'll see these strange differences that were made that makes
the lectionary too. You'll see the beginning of avoiding judgment and wrath, making those optional readings.
Oh yeah, no, the lectionary is a real butchering. Both the 1943 and the original 1928, both are affected by the historical criticism movements, and also are terrified of using words like circumcision, and also cut out things like Queen of Heaven. You can't talk about that because, of course, in Jeremiah, mentions of the Queen of Heaven are not positive, shall we say. So those kinds of things are all cut out too. And again, I think that is a real shame. That's an enormous advantage of the 1662 International Edition, even over, quite frankly, the Cambridge 1662, because the 1662 International Edition maintains the Cranmer-Parker lectionary, which is great and much easier to use, in fact,
Sure.
because it sticks to chapters rather than sort of cutting up chapters based upon the weird proclivities of the men who were developing those later lectionaries. I also would mention that the 28, when they were producing it, made some weird decision that we don't even know about, because they burned all the notes from when they were getting together, which is also odd.
It
a
is.
thing I think would do with one that's on the up and up.
Yeah.
And the American prayer book tradition also suffers from, just at its genesis in the 1789, from William White and Samuel Seabury having such an influence. And White had some weird ideas. We don't really need the Athanasian Creed. We really don't need the Nicene Creed, was also his position, which thank God got overturned. And Seabury's insistence on bringing over part of the Scottish liturgy. These are kind of weird things that happened in history that were only because at that time the Episcopal Church was so tiny and was so there's weird things happen in organizations at those times, and
and the latitudinarianism was crazy,
so, and the deists and all of that. So, like, to me, like, to sort of hold that up as being like, oh no, we can't possibly ever change this. And in terms of what book to use now, because the ACNA offers multiple prayer books, my own REC, Reformed Episcopal Church, authorizes multiple prayer books. It isn't as if there is one universal prayer book that is being used on the continent. And so to me, it makes sense to use the best one. And I think the 1662 International is the best one. And I kind of staked my life on it and burned the ships when we came out here. So, so that's kind of where I am. And again, we've seen the fruit of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for answering that inside baseball question. Maybe that was more for me than for our listeners, but
it's another good thing. My final point on that is it's wonderful when I have a guest, because I don't have to start with, well, here's what happened in the Protestant Episcopal Church over the years, and go through all that history. I can just go, let's go to the Reformation.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful. That is such a freeing thing.
Yeah.
Right. I can talk about the Reformation, and even what was being met, what was the purpose of all that, rather than getting to the messy weeds of 20th century.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Protestant Episcopal.
I'm in a 2019 parish, and even just yesterday, I'm walking a college student, preparing him for baptism, and he asks about, he has a 79 prayer book.
Yes.
And he doesn't know, and that's fine. Right. But asking about the oil of chrism and what that means, and it's like, it puts me in this situation where, because I'm a critic of the 79, I'm a critic of the 2019 insofar as it takes heed from the 79. I have to do all this historical, like, this is what happened, this is what's going on, and then I have to say all this stuff before I say, but in the 62 and for 400 years of Anglicanism, this is how baptism and confirmation were viewed. I have to do this whole other kind of historical explaining, which is always complicated. I don't even know if the person, I feel a duty to acknowledge the history, and I don't even know how helpful it is. So I resonate, on that level with what you're saying there. Yeah,
it's incredible. Yes, I highly recommend it.
Absolutely. Well, Father Tarsitano, thank you so much for joining me for this interview. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope our listeners will as well. And for any listeners out there that are newer to Anglicanism, or maybe some of your reservations about the 62 were answered, I'd encourage you, order a copy from InterVarsity. It's an excellent prayer book, and go deeper. Go deeper. This is a ripe time in Anglicanism. There's so many resets are kind of happening on a macro level anyway. So why not, join the reset and go back to the original sources, go back to the way that Anglicans prayed all throughout the world for centuries. So thank you, Father Tarsitano.
You're very, very welcome. And for those interested in kind of learning more about that, there's also a very excellent book, How to Use the Book of Common Prayer, which we hand out to our guests and has been incredibly useful. Look for that, How to Use the Book of Common Prayer. And then a fellow presbyter and I, Stephen Wedgeworth, are going through the prayer book right now in our podcast, Black and Red All Over.
Yep.
Which I highly recommend you look for. And if you want to see how the daily office looks on a day-to-day basis, You can also tune into the 1662 daily podcast, which I'm privileged to be able to offer on a daily basis.
Yeah. Well, I'll put a link to the podcast. I've recommended that to several people in my parish who want to go deeper, and it's a great resource. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. God bless you.
Likewise.